What if stories and legends can offer us the key to unravelling the hottest political issues of the day? What would it mean if all the answers to today's burning questions were presented in easy-to-digest narratives and myths? Join us as we examine some of the most fascinating tales, some mythological, some historical, and apply their lessons to understanding the chaos of modern politics. I'm your host, Mark Angelides. Welcome to The Rabbit Hole, Politics and Prose, a LibertyNation.com production. Right now, it seems that on the lips of every commentator, every pundit, are the words, gun control. In the wake of a tragedy, it's all too easy to make hasty decisions that appeal to a base need to do something. But perhaps, like many decisions that are made from emotion rather than careful thought, they can lead to more harm than good through unintended consequences. We've discussed one-step thinking and the dangers therein on the rabbit hole before, so I won't rehash that idea. But today, rather, I want to talk about the darker side of the human spirit, the history and culture of one of man's driving impulses, murder. As a species, we've been killing each other since before we were even human. For those of you that think primates don't engage in murder and brutality, think again. Chimpanzees are violent yet wonderful creatures. Studies carried out show that murder and brutality among chimp groups is shockingly high. Whether it's the overthrowing of a tyrannical group leader or targeting chimps from other groups when the attackers have numerical superiority, the instances of observed murders is surprisingly high. Formerly, many tried to argue that the violence was due to man's interference in the lives of these otherwise peaceable creatures. But studies published in 2014 show something very different. In fact, this is now the prevailing view. It turns out that chimp groups murder each other because of adaptive strategies. Whether this is a high number of males in a group seeking dominance over each other, or overpopulation causing resources to be scarce, or even just because it creates better access to those resources. These murderous strategies are well documented and pretty much unquestioned nowadays. Chimps, of course, don't use guns, yet the murder rate remains high, which begs the question, when we hear this talk of gun control now, something must be done, is it the actual murder that the politicians are trying to stop? If so, banning guns doesn't seem the most sensible route to take. Throughout history, there have been attempts to curtail violence among the population, but it's not until the last 100 or 150 years that banning actual weapons has ever been seriously attempted. Rather, rules and regulations, some official, some more based on traditional culture, have been encouraged. Let's look at a few examples that still have a direct impact on how we live our lives today. For the first example, we ask a question. Why do Americans drive on the right-hand side of the road and British on the left? This may not be something you consciously think about on a day-to-day basis, but the roots of this harken back to medieval times. Formerly, everyone used to drive on the left or ride on the left, with very good reason. When riding a horse, a knight would want to keep his sword arm closest to the person passing him on the opposite side. This allowed him the opportunity of defense. If the person coming toward him was a threat, he could quickly pull his sword and deal with what he needed to deal with. Yet much of this has changed for many countries with the advent of big trade and mild coercion, and perhaps unsurprisingly, Napoleon Bonaparte was behind it all. The custom of riding on the left had been fairly common standard and in fact endorsed by Pope Boniface back in 1300, and it was pretty much used everywhere. But Napoleon, during the Revolution, wanted to upset the apple cart. Wagons that Napoleon himself would use for transporting foods, goods and supplies would necessarily have a team of horses, on which the driver of those horses would need to sit on the rear left horse, so he could still use his whip in his right hand. Napoleon was, as he often was, enraged that the upper classes would stick to the traditional way of doing things and force the working man to adhere to something that was more beneficial to themselves, and demanded that folk began driving on the right. This had the added, as he saw it, advantage of stopping people making surprise attacks on those who they were passing, unless, of course, the attack was left-handed. This effort has spread across the world. The British refused to adopt anything that came from Napoleon and decided to stick with the left, where Brits still drive today. Changing the side of the road was a simple shift, but it did more to stop random attacks and robberies that ended in death than we can ever really calculate. And what of the British Parliament? If you've ever seen the layout of the House of Commons, the Westminster Palace, you'll see that one party faces the other party, the other leading party, in a row of seats, and these are parallel to each other. When surely a more circular method aids in communication, you might think, much like the American Congress. But there's a story behind this. The distance between the opposition front benches is actually 2 sword lengths, presumably because in the earlier days of politics, members of the House would wish to engage in duels to settle their disputes. Having that precise distance between opposing politicians was more a reminder that they should settle their differences peacefully, rather than a practical measure to stop swordplay. But note that the idea of banning swords from the House was never their first solution. Even such commonplace things as the salute come from traditions made strong through centuries of trying to curb baser impulse. When knights would pass each other on the road, or meet somewhere, perhaps even on a field of battle, they would lift the visor of their helmet to display their faces, so the other person would know who they are and whether they intended fair or foul play. This action of lifting the visor, over many years it's become the salute that we recognize today in our military and police forces. All of these examples, all of these minor things, they were designed to balance behavior, to make bloodshed less likely. Robert Heinlein, the sci-fi author, wrote in his book Beyond This Horizon that, quote, "An armed society is a polite society. Manners are good when one may have to back up his acts with his life." End quote. And we can see that this holds true throughout history. Think of the duels between gentlemen of Europe. If an affront was given, a duel, completely legal, could be arranged, where the two parties would meet at an agreed time, bringing along their seconds to stand in for them, if needed, and witnesses, and they would settle the dispute. This did not always, or even often, result in death. An apology could be made in front of the witnesses. A wide shot where the shooter would miss on purpose would settle the matter of honour, but resulted in no death. Or when duels were fought with swords, it was often only to first blood, a harmless scratch that signified something greater. And then there's the Wild West, which, despite endless fantastic movies depicting a showdown between quick-draw artists at high noon, was a relatively peaceful place. If there was a chance that someone you offended could kill you, people were far more careful with how they acted. Bringing us back to today, the idea that banning guns would lead to less death is a false one. We need only look to Europe, where terrorist attacks rarely involve guns. Trucks and cars are the new weapon of choice for the would-be terrorist. In Nice, France, in 2016, an ISIS-inspired terrorist drove a heavy truck into a crowd of people. 87 dead and over 400 injured. In the following year, 2017, there are around 20 such vehicle attacks. And of course we have London, where knife attacks are so ubiquitous that the murder rate is higher than New York. Guns are not available in Europe, not widely, and so people turn to vehicles and knives to deal out their death and destruction. People are going to kill each other, just like chimps. Banning guns won't stop the murder, but traditions, culture, history, these things combined make it less likely that murder will happen. by understanding that we have a history and that subtle changes to our shared culture have done far more to prevent needless death than any heavy-handed legislation or bans could ever manage, is something we need to embrace and understand. We need to take on board our past and use it to shape our future. Thank you for listening to The Rabbit Hole, Politics and Prose, a LibertyNation.com production. Join us next episode, where we'll be talking more history, politics, legends and stories. Until next time, thanks for listening.